All right, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Course of Action. My guest tonight is an absolute machine in the publishing world. It's Don Bentley. Don, how are you?
I'm doing great, Jeff. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for cutting out time. I know you're a busy man. You know, you got three books out this year. You're taking over the Mitch Rapp series here, and I'm sure you're diving into that. And uh, I can't imagine what your schedule is like, but we'll get into it here in a little bit. But I mean, what is it like, being you right now, having such a, full plate?
Yeah, I am actually the last 2.5 years have been pretty crazy where I was on a schedule where I had to crank out a book about every 5 months. That's how I got to where I could have three books come out this year. So Forgotten War, the fourth book in my Matt Drake series came out in April, and then I had Flashpoint, which is the third Clancy book that came out in May, and then my fourth Clancy book called Weapons Grade will come out in September. And so it's been pretty crazy. Like you said, though, I've now transitioned to Mitch Rapp, and so from that standpoint, my schedule's a little bit more relaxed now because Mitch is the only thing I'm concentrating on right now. I still have something else I want to work on next, but for the next couple of months, it's only Mitch until I get a first draft done, and then depending on when I get that sucker done, I might transition to the next thing of mine I'm going to work on.
So let's first talk about Forgotten War, which for you
Yeah.
was a very kind of personal book because of the connection you have. And as an Apache pilot, as a guy, member of the Army, I was in the Air
Hmm.
Force. We saw kind of how the pullout of
Sure.
Afghanistan happened, and I think that's something that really hit you hard when you were going to develop
Yeah.
this. Can you tell a little bit about that emotional connection to the book?
Yeah, absolutely. So I started writing Forgotten War during the withdrawal from Afghanistan. And so I knew I kind of had a high level idea what I wanted or I thought the book might be about. But once once the withdrawal started happening, and I just was just dumbfounded watching kind of 20 years worth of blood and treasure and sacrifice just go up in ash, just go up in flames. And it hit me really hard. And so Forgotten War became much more Afghanistan centric. And so as I was trying to, there were a couple of weeks where I couldn't even work. I wrote a couple editorials just because I had to find some way to process what I was thinking, but I
Mhm.
couldn't work on the book. And as I was trying to reconcile what was happening with what I was feeling and what I'd been through, I kept getting over and over again some version of the question of was it worth it from friends of mine, from people who served, from acquaintances. And I didn't know how to answer that question. And so it very much became the theme of Forgotten War. Forgotten War is very much a book of fiction, and it's meant to entertain you and keep you way up past your bedtime, or and hopefully it does that. But it is based on some actual events that happened, or things that were close to happening that I took some liberties with. But the kind of the emotional core of Forgotten War, the things the characters say to each other, the feelings that they're trying to process, all that is very much true. And many of those conversations are reflective of conversations I had with my fellow Afghanistan veterans as the collapse was happening.
Yeah, I think it was a very emotional time, for a lot of people, that were
Hmm.
active duty and, veterans. I had a lot of veteran friends myself. It came up in conversation and it was like,
Yeah,
it's a tough one, and it is very political decision and all that. And regardless of what you may think about it, it was a very tough thing to watch
sure.
just happen because a lot of innocent people, there's a lot of chaos. It was a tough thing to swallow, and very cool to see how you kind of channeled that. And for a lot of veterans out there who, you know, um, writing is kind of therapeutic, and you found a little bit of therapy in doing that and kind of getting that out on paper. And I encourage a lot of other veterans to do that. But what was it like compared? What was finishing Forgotten War like compared to the other Matt Drake books because of that kind of that connection?
Yeah, I'd say it was a lot more difficult for a number of reasons. And so one of the things I knew that I wanted to try and do in Forgotten War is So my two main characters are Matt Drake, that's a DIA case officer, which is kind of a fancy way of saying that he's a spy, and he's a former Army Ranger. And then his best friend is a former Delta Force sniper, who goes by his radio call sign of Frodo, who has been pretty grievously wounded, and so he doesn't work as a sniper anymore, but he still works with Matt in DIA, in the Defense Intelligence Agency. And so, this being the fourth book, I'd had a lot of comments from readers up until now saying, "Man, we'd love to see Matt and Frodo work together. We'd love to see when they first met." And so, when I started Forgotten War, started writing it, originally I had the idea of writing a complete throwback novel to look at just when Frodo and Matt first got together, and maybe their first tour of duty in Iraq, and kind of how they met, and their shakeout tour, if you will. And so I was talking to my editor, Tom Colgan, about it, and he said, instead of doing that, he's like, "Have you read?" At the time, it was Mark Graney's latest book, Burner. And I was like, "No, I haven't yet." And he's like, "Read that, because he does something really interesting where he has two timelines that he alternates between in the book, and one is present day, and one is obviously a number of years before." And so I read that, and I'm like, "Man, that would be really hard, but that would actually be really interesting." And one of the things that Tom Colgan uses Mark Groening as an example a lot, because Mark's a fantastic writer, and I think he
Yes.
uses it to kind of prod the rest of us. And he said, one of the things that makes Mark such a fantastic writer is he never just calls it in. He never just phones it in. He always pushes himself further with every book. And so I thought, well, maybe if it's scaring me and I don't know if I can pull it off, maybe I should try that. And so it was hard to do that. And then once I realized I wanted to use some actual events in Afghanistan during it, then I had another constraint that I was working on, because I knew I wanted to show Matt and Frodo trying to work within the confines of Afghanistan crumbling around them in what is their present day. That was actually in August of 2021. And so there were some real life events I knew I needed to incorporate, but I also knew the timing wasn't going to work exactly right. And so this book is the first one that I also have an author's note for, because I played with. So in reality, when the Taliban took Bagram and then Kabul, and then all of that stuff happened very, very quickly, and I spaced it out a little bit more in my book. And then there were also some things that I wanted to show, that were tragedies that were centric to the withdrawal from Afghanistan, but I wanted to do it in a way where it didn't feel trite, that it didn't feel like I was grabbing this really tragic event and using it just as a plot device in my book. And so it was really, really hard to balance all of that in Forgotten War. And um, I think and then the last part of it that made it difficult too was from the political standpoint. I have, as every American does, probably some very strong feelings about it, but I didn't want it to be a book about politics. I wanted it to just be, here is what the men and women who served in Afghanistan, who lost loved ones there, who lost brothers and sisters in arms, here's what they're thinking as they're watching this crumble around them. And so some of the reviews of Forgotten War that I'm most proud of were something along the lines of, he didn't throw rocks, he just told it how it was, and kind of let the reader draw their own conclusion. And so all that was very gratifying, but it was also a very hard book to write, because, like a lot of folks who served in Afghanistan, I had a really bad day on June 28th, 2005. And some of that actually plays into Forgotten Wars, referenced in Forgotten War. And so I don't know that when I got to the end of the book, whether I was any closer to answering that question, was it worth it or not? And so and as you're doing all this, you can't, or at least I didn't want to let myself forget that my primary goal is still to tell a really, really great story. And I think a lot of times, or not a lot of times, but there's a potential as fiction writers that if you come into a book saying, here's the theme, or here's the thing I want to beat the reader about the head and shoulders with, that it comes off really preachy, and it comes off to the detriment of the story, where the story just becomes a vehicle for you to give the reader the lesson you want them to learn. And I didn't want that. I just wanted to tell a really, really good story that happened to be really personal to me. And so I think this book, more than any of them, it's always really hard for me to read my books when I'm done, because I'm super critical of them, even when they're finally finished and in print form. If
Yeah.
I open them up and start reading them, I just find errors. But the way I kind of get around that or circumvent it in my head is to listen to Scott Brick read them. And this one might have been the one I was most proud of. Like when he read it, even though I knew that was coming, there were parts that still kind of got me and would choke me up listening to him read it. And so it was really fulfilling, but it was really, really hard to write for a number of reasons.
So what is kind of like your writing strategy? Are you a plotter? Do you kind of fly by the seat of your pants a little bit? What's it like with all these projects going on? What's it really like for Don Bentley
Yeah.
to kind of solidify his day?
Yeah, I wish I was a plotter. I think reader or writers tend to fall in one of two groups, right? Either the plotters, the people who know the story before they begin writing it, or the Stephen James calls them organic writers, but most people call them pantsers, or the people who you're telling the story to yourself as you write it. And I very much fall into the second category. And so when I start a book, I usually have an idea of kind of the inciting incident, and that's just kind of writer's talk. For if you think of Star Wars, the inciting incident is when Luke Skywalker went from just being a farm boy to somebody on the path to potentially becoming a Jedi, kind of that inflection point. And so I usually know that, and I don't know much of the rest of the story until I write it. And so what I try to do is stay true to a word count every day that gets me a rough draft or a first draft that is finished at least a month, preferably more than a month before it's due. So I can take a good month and then revise it several times. And so what typically happens is as I write, I used to try and every time I learned something new in the book, go back and fix all the pages until then. Like I'd realize,
Hmm.
hey, these two characters should be combined, or it should really be this, not that, or here's in I've learned since then that that's kind of the path to madness, because what you'll continually do, or what I do, is continuously revise and revise, and you never make any forward progress.
Right.
And so I leave myself a lot of notes, and then I actually have a journal that I'll oftentimes start the day with and just write down thoughts about the book or things that I think need to be fixed or explored, or if it's something really egregious, I use the notes function in Word a lot too, where I'll put in a note that says, hey, up until this point, it's been this, but I really need to change the character, and just leave that for subsequent drafts. Because the first draft for me is really about finding what the story's about. And when I get stuck, what I'll do a lot is go back and read what I've written so far. Because oftentimes, if you write organically, you've been probably self-consciously dropping those little breadcrumbs in there. And there are Stephen James he has a great book called Story Trump Structure, and he talks about the the three questions that he asks himself as he writes is, what are the questions that I've raised in previous chapters that I haven't answered yet? What can I do to make life harder for my protagonist? And what could I do to raise the stakes? And so oftentimes, like if I go through that, it gives me an idea of what to come next. But there's still a lot of gray space in there where even though I just, my eighth book is coming out now and I'm working on my ninth, there's still times where you're like, I don't, this is going to be the book that tanks it, where I never finish it, where I can't figure out how it should go. And I think some of the part, Nick Petrie's a good friend of mine, and he's the writer that the Peter Ash, his first book is called The Drifter. It's a fantastic series. And he and I talk about writing a lot. And he told me once that he thinks with every book, your process evolves a little bit, and you understand yourself as a writer a little bit more. And I think one of the keys, if you're going to do this for a living, is getting to the point where you know your process enough that you begin to trust it. And so for me, what that looks like is that even, if I'm 25,000 words into a book and I just feel like it's going nowhere, I know that eventually if I keep writing it, that magic thing that I haven't figured out yet, future Don will figure it out. But it still doesn't make it any easier for present Don when I'm like, what in the world is this book actually about? It's the most boring thing ever. And so my wife all the time will say, you say every book sucks. And I'm like, it does, until about the last 2 weeks before I turn it in, because it takes me that long to figure out what the story's actually about and what the twists are and stuff. And so it doesn't make it any easier. It doesn't, but it's I think I've gotten to the point where I'm like, okay, it'll come eventually, as long as I'm true to trying to hit that word count every day.
So I know you've worked with Tom Colgan for quite a while now, and even
Hmm.
into the Clancy series, he was the editor. He was right there by your side. Did
Yeah.
stepping into the Clancy series change your work ethic and change your approach at all, or did you kind of keep that same mindset and attack it the same way?
Yeah, it had to change it because I had to write so much faster. And so I had, like I said, once I took on the Clancy job, I had to write a book every 5 months. So if you look at 5 months and you say a month of that is revising the book, you really only have 4 months. And usually at some point when you're drafting one book, you get copy edits for the other book, which can take a couple weeks to do it. So really you're looking at cranking out a rough draft in 3.5 months or so, maybe.
Mm.
And so it had to be before I was published, one of the first times I met Brad Taylor. I remember seeing him on a panel, and when Brad started out, he's a fantastic writer, New York Times bestseller, the Pike Logan series. He was writing two Pike Logan books, full-length books, and one or two novellas, and then he also had a part-time job. And so I remember somebody asking him in a panel, and he's like, "Brad, do you ever get writer's block?" And so if you don't know, Brad was a former Delta Force troop and squadron commander, and so he looked back at the person who asked the question with his best like steely-eyed commando look, and he's like, I don't have time for writer's block. And so I think there's some truth to that, right? Where if you don't have time to second guess yourself, if you know the only words you can revise are words that are written, it forces you to be more diligent and fanatical about that word count that you get it every day. And so I had to increase my word count pretty substantially. I remember thinking for a while, if I could only write what Mark Graney does a day, then I'll be good, because Mark's pretty prolific. And so I thought he was only writing 2,000 words a day. And so I got to the point where only I was writing 2,000 words a day. And then I saw an interview with Mark, and he's like, I write 3,000 words a day. I'm like, son of a gun. I'm still not up at Mark Graney. And so then I went back and was reading On Writing by Stephen King, or maybe I Googled it, and he said he does 2,000 words a day. And so for a while, my wife would ask me, she's like, did you have a Mark Graney day or a Stephen King day? And I'm like, well, somewhere in between usually. But when you write that much, it's really, really hard to do, but it means you're also discovering big chunks of the story every day. And so then it becomes easier, in theory, because you know more of the story every single day. 2,000 words is 8 pages. 3,000 words is whatever, 12 pages or something. And so that's a big chunk every week that you're doing. So I did that. I have another friend who's a fantastic writer. He writes a series of westerns under the name of John Deacon, and he's written all kinds of stuff. And so he is primarily self-pubbed. And he told me, as I was I was wrestling a lot with how to physically write that many words without getting burned out, when to take breaks and something. And so he turned me on to this formula that I still use that works really, really well, where you set your alarm for 15 minutes and you write for 15 minutes, you take 5 minutes off, you write for 15 minutes, and you take 25 minutes off. And so what that looks like, and then you just repeat the cycle over and over again. And so basically of every hour, you're spending half an hour writing and half an hour not. And that 25 minutes is when you do the bigger things. You go for a walk, you get something to eat, whatever. And so what I started doing is doing those, and I would keep an Excel spreadsheet how many words I got with each of those sessions. And so even when I was trying to write 2,500 or 3,000 words a day, you slowly chip away with it. And you're like, if I just sit here and type in 15 minutes, I can come up with at least 250 words. If I'm really flying, maybe I can get closer to 500 words. Well, you do that 4 times and you've got 2,000 words, and so there's something magical about that little thing, and it gives you 5 minutes, to go walk around the house, get another cup of coffee, or 25 minutes to take a little longer. And I still use that, even though right now my word count is a lot less per day, but I'll still use that theory, because at least what I was finding is I would try and set my alarm for an hour or 20, and invariably around the 12 or 15 minute mark, you need a break anyway. Your mind starts to drift, or you want to get up and stretch or something like that. And so that's been, from a tactical perspective, that's been really, really helpful to me.
What would be your like one piece of advice for writers of any genre that are looking to do this full time? What would be your one piece of advice? Like, no joke, stick to this and stick to your guns.
Yeah, I guess I would take your question and change it a little bit, because it's really, really hard to do this full time. I think what I would do is start with the get published. And I would the advice that like Brad Taylor and Mark Greaney and Nick Petrie gave to me was to delay. If you're lucky enough to publish multiple books, delay going writing full time as long as you possibly can. And so I worked another job even while I still had the Clancy books for a while, because once you transition from this is your side hustle and you can take that money and sock it away, to now your mortgage gets paid or not based on the words that you write, it's a big, big transition. And from a business side, publishing is crazy. Like, I have never been in a business before where um, the the deadlines or the milestones where you get paid are so easily moved that oftentimes you don't get paid on time, or something happens and maybe you don't make your deadline, or all of these things, where if you have money socked up, so that because you've been saving, you've been waiting to mold full time, and you can cash flow yourself, it is a whole different experience than if you say, hey, I finally got a book deal or a book deal and a half, and I think I can write full time barely if I do that. And so, if you want to do this, my first piece of advice would be to wait as long as possible to go full time, until you. I think what Mark Greaney told me is that the work will come before the money does, and so what will probably happen is, if you're lucky, you will have more work than you can physically do with your day job, and then you have to make the decision, and hopefully you've been socking money away, so that if you do make that decision, you can take a gamble on yourself and say, hey, I'm going to go full time and hope my advances start to increase and stuff like that. But taking all that back, I think the question I get the most, or I think is the most valid, is how do I get a book published? And so, to me, when somebody comes and says, I want to write a book in whatever genre, say fantasy, or thrillers or romance or whatever, my first question to them every single time is, tell me the 3 books in your genre that are bestsellers right now that your book should be shelved next to. And if they can't tell me that, that's a big red flag, because for commercial fiction, you are trying to sell into a niche of a marketplace. So, for instance, I know that my book should be on the shelf next to Brad Taylor and Mark Greaney and hopefully Brad Thor and Vince Flynn and all those big. But now you have to do something that's called the same but different. I'm never going to write a better Brad Taylor book than Brad does, so I have to offer something different. But if I don't know that, if I haven't read those books, if I don't constantly read those books, then I don't know what my customers expect. And so you could have a person who loves espionage thrillers and buys my book, and also loves romance or loves the Outlander books and buy those, but they're going to expect 2 very different books if they buy an Outlander book and they buy my book. As the author, I have to understand what my customer expects, what their expectations are for that genre. And the way you gain that knowledge is by reading extensively in your genre. And so if you don't know that, you're going to have a really hard time writing a book that belongs in that genre. And it's the same thing with grammar, right? Like as a writer, you can write sentences that are one paragraph, but you can only break the rules if you understand what the rules are and are consciously deciding when to break them. It's the same thing with genre fiction. You have to live and breathe the genre that you want to write in so you understand what, number one, what reader expectations are. Number two, how you're going to vary from what Mark Greaney and Brad Thor and and Vince Flynn and Brad Taylor, what all of those guys do really well. You got to do something different, but you have to understand what they do first. And then the final thing is that if you're fortunate enough to write a book that's good enough for somebody to buy, your agent is going to have to tell your future editor, here's what it's like, here's where it belongs on the shelf. And your future publisher is going to have to go out to booksellers like Barnes and Noble and say, hey, Don's book should be on the shelf next to Brad Taylor's. Here's why. But if you don't know that, you aren't, number one, aren't going to be able to tell anybody else that. And number two, you're not going to be able to write a book that fits in that niche. And I had to learn that firsthand. My first three books that I wrote didn't sell. And so when my second or third book didn't sell, that same guy, John Deacon, that I was talking about, he and I were walking in a mall together, and I was complaining to him about how I'd written another book that hadn't sold. And he's like, tell you what, let's go in the bookstore. And we walked in the bookstore, and he's like, point to three books your book should be on the shelf. And I knew, and I pointed those three that are bestsellers. And he's like, let's get them down and read the first chapter. And we read the first chapter of all three of those. And so in the first chapter of all three of those best-selling books in the genre that I wanted to write on, either somebody was killed, somebody used a weapon, or at least somebody mentioned a weapon. And so he looked at me and he's like, does that happen in your book? And it didn't. And so it's not to say that you have to copy that, but what it means is the readers expected something that I didn't deliver. Now, they probably wouldn't have come back and said, you got to kill somebody in the first chapter, and you didn't. But what they might say is something like, this book, it starts kind of slow, or it took me a while to get into it, because
Yeah.
they've been conditioned to expect something, and I didn't know what that something was, and I broke the rules without understanding them. And so that's the advice I'd give somebody, is if you don't, the shorter version of that is, if somebody says, I want to be a writer, and I say, what do you read? And they say, I don't really read. And I'm like, well, good luck with that.
Yeah. I think I wrote two books. One was a fiction, one was a nonfiction, and my publisher said, I like them both, but we're gonna go with the nonfiction first. Super grateful, and I said, great, that's awesome. And I asked him, why not the fiction? What was wrong with it? Because I believed in my heart that it was my better
Hmm.
product. And he said,
Yeah.
well, it's not your better product. And I was like, what? Like, I was just blown away. And the more I
Hmm.
thought about it, the more I was like, well, I'm thankful that they didn't pick that up, because it was garbage.
Yeah.
Because I wasn't
Yeah.
doing what you're talking about. I wasn't being a student. I wasn't going back and
And that,
reading Brad Thor and all those and saying, how did he do this? Why did he pace it like this? And
yeah.
what's that first
And
chapter
that can
about?
be, yeah, and that can be one of the drawbacks of self-publishing. And again, I have two friends who do it phenomenally well, and they're great writers, and they make good livings doing it. But they were both accomplished writers before they started self-pubbing. And so I heard, it might have been Steve Barry or something, when somebody asked him a question about it. And he said, look, if you self-publish too early, you can either learn how to write in private, or you can learn how to write in public. And so if you're not a good enough writer yet, and you throw it up on the internet, that you run the risk then of, when you get to be a good enough writer, either to self-publish it and do it well, or to get a traditional job, a traditional publishing contract, that they find those books and are like, I don't know about this guy, because this one wasn't quite there. Am I going to take a chance on the other one? And that would be, one of the cautions that I'd ask is, like, you have to learn how to write one way or another. It's better that you learn how to write in private until you get to the point where you're good enough that you can put your stuff out in the public and people will want to buy it.
So, like, I think I've used some beta readers this year for the first time. I've really sent some stuff out, 50 and 100 pages, and I was
Yeah.
really hesitant to at first, 'cause I thought the judgment was really going to hit me hard. In fact, it was the opposite. Like Ema Adair came back and said, "I love what you're doing, but why would they do
Hmm.
this before this? Why did you say
Yeah.
this? What did this mean? I'm confused." And I thought that was exactly like your point.
Yeah.
I learned how to write and fix some of those things in private as opposed to putting it out
Yeah.
there. So it was really smart to do that, and it really kind of changed my thought process. But to your point, and being a student of the game, being a student of it,
Yeah.
it's not just I'm going to write a story and I'm going to put it out there. Look at
Yeah.
guys like you who have done it before, and ask what did I like about that, and kind of taking those notes and then going back. And
Yeah.
I think that's a big deal. And
Yeah.
go ahead.
Yeah. I've told, I know I've told this story a bunch of times, but when my third book didn't sell, and I couldn't figure out why, I took my favorite Vince Flynn book and I broke it down by note card. And so I used a different note card for every character, broke it down, every single scene in the note cards. And we lived in a little house at the time. I didn't have an office. And so I taped it to my bedroom wall, which my wife was less than thrilled about. But when I had that up in the wall and I could take a step back and look at it, it was kind of like the difference between looking at a house and looking at the blueprints of the house. And so then I could finally say, well, what did I like? Like, I love chapter 16. How did Vince set that up? How did he get me to the point where I couldn't breathe there? Or even like more tactical things, like how many chapters does Vince go without bringing Mitch Rapp back into the game? How many, when he brings up, how many fight scenes does he do, in the first act? How many? And so you can look at what the writer is actually doing, especially a master like Vince. It's more than what the writer's doing. It's like, how is the writer manipulating the reader through this book that they've done, right? And so that was huge to me, and so I started doing that with a lot of books. It's in grad school we called it close reading, where you read a book first as a writer, or excuse me, as a reader, and then you read it as a second time as a writer, and you pull apart, like, I love this, what did they do? Or this dialogue was really great, how did they do it? And so that's another part of being a writer. And again, you can't do that unless you read. You can't. It's another thing. Like, if you want to write thrillers, military thrillers or espionage thrillers, and I say to you, what is the best, fight scene you've ever read, or what's the best, what scene had you, and you should be able to say, it was Daniel Silva, it was the whichever book it was. For me, it's the one, and I forget what it's, a two-part book, but it's the when the Russian oligarch is captured, and the scene where he goes, and Gabriel Alon's wife is kidnapped and is in this little Russian dacha, and he thinks she's about to be killed, and he's trying to get there. Like, that is the most climactic scene I've ever read in my life, and I can't tell you how many times I've gone back to that scene. I'm like, how did he do that? How did he get me to the point where I couldn't breathe? Because I've
Yeah.
read a book or two in my life, and this one still sticks out to that. And so you have to be able to do that as a writer. You have to have read enough and to have those books, and like, let me go back to that, let me go back to see how he or she did that. And it's impossible to do if you don't read widely in your genre.
So let's shift just a little bit into Weapons Grade, which is the next Clancy book that you have coming out in September. Want to talk about it just for a little bit, and then we'll leave off with Mitch Rapp before I let you go. But what was it like? Is this your final Clancy book, do you think, or are there more
It's
in the
my
future?
final one for now. It's my final one for now. So I don't, somebody else is going to write the next Clancy books. I don't know that that means I'm done forever. That's one of the great things about Tom Colgan and working with him. But somebody else will be taking over for me for the next books for sure. And so when I wrote Flashpoint, I knew I wanted to tell a bigger story than I had in Target Acquired, which was my first Clancy book, or Zero Hour. And in fact, I think if you look at it, each one of those books becomes a bigger story. And so Target Acquired was a very narrowly focused Jack Ryan Jr. Zero Hour was still more narrowly focused, but it also showed potential war on the Korean Peninsula. And so there was some really fun. I had a kind of my homage to being a young scout platoon leader in Korea. And so I had this whole Apache section in there. And then Target acquired, I knew I wanted to write a book that was much bigger, that would have for the first time Jack Ryan Sr. and the White House in there. And so I had some really long conversations with Mark Cameron about it, because there were things I wanted to show in there that I knew I would need Jack Ryan to show, but I didn't want to write Jack Ryan Sr. because Mark did. And the same reason I knew Clark had to be a part of it, but I didn't want to write it from his point of view because Mark writes it differently than I would write it. And so we actually kind of negotiated. And I'm like, well, what if I used Mary Pat, because she hasn't been used, as much, and I could use her as the point of view character for. And so we figured all that out. And so it ended up being a really, really big book. And when Tom Colgan, my editor, got it, he's like, this is actually a Jack Ryan Sr. book. He's like, you wrote not a Jack Ryan Jr. This is a Jack Ryan Sr. book. So when I sat down to write Weapons Grade, Tom Colgan said, well, what are you going to do? And I said, you know what? The last one was so big. I just want to narrow the focus on this. I think I want to write about, my son goes to school at Texas A&M, and it's about 2 hours east of here. And there are all these little Texas towns that you drive through, and every one of them has two things. It has a Pizza Hut and a brand new bank. And I'm like, why would it have a brand new bank? What's going on in this little town? And so I kind of pitched that idea to Tom Colgan, and he's like, oh, that'll be perfect. It'll be like a Jack Reacher kind of thing. Write that. And I said, yeah, that's what I'm going to write. And so I started writing it, and I had 5 months to write it. And so about month 4, Tom Colgan emails me, and he's like, hey, here's some potential covers for the book. Here's some titles. And they were great covers if it still would have been a story about Jack Ryan Jr. kicking around in a small Texas town. And so by then it had completely changed. And so I wrote something back to him, and I said, yeah, so now there's this subplot where the Iranians are trying to reach breakout on their nuclear weapons program, and there's kind of a hypersonics angle to it. And so to his credit, he just wrote back and he said, is something going to blow up? Because I could put that on the cover. And I'm like, yeah, and here are some potential ones. And so it ended up, I'm a huge aviation nut. And for anybody that's an aviation nut, there's like one plane, I think, that captures all of our attention, and it's the SR-71. And
Oh,
so
yeah.
the SR-71's been retired for a long time, but I love what people are trying to do with hypersonics now. There's a little startup company in Georgia, and it's called Hermeus, and they're trying to make the first hypersonic jet airliner. And part of the way they're funding it is by making the first hypersonic drone for the Air Force. So I shouldn't say the first hypersonic drone, but it's the first hypersonic drone that has a variable cycle engine. And so what that means is normally you can have an airplane like the SR-71 that can get up to Mach 2 or Mach 3. But if you go beyond Mach 3, you need a completely different type of engine. And that's why many of the hypersonic missiles or cruise missiles, they start with a solid rocket booster, getting it up fast enough to be able to use that second engine. Well, Hermeus has come up with this idea where they call it a variable cycle engine, that they have one engine that does both. And it's fascinating. And so when I was watching some Hermeus stuff, they had on a retired 4-star general who had flown SR-71s. In fact, he flew U-2s as well. And so I got his name, and I'm like, hey, can I ask you some questions? Because I'm thinking about doing something for hypersonics and this Tom Clancy. And so we spent 2 hours on the phone where he's walking me through all these amazing missions he flew in the airplane. And so, long story short, the SR-71 plays a significant role in Weapons Grade, where I brought it out of retirement to be a chase plane for this first hypersonic drone that they're working on. And I made, his name is Bob. I think you pronounce his last name Bear. So when I got done, I'm like, I need an SR-71 pilot for this book. Do you want to be him? And he's like, yes, I want to be him. And so he's actually a character in the book. And so it was a ton of fun to write, but it took me a long time, kind of going full circle to where we started, to figure out what I was missing. Because I was writing the book, I'm like, there has to be something more here. It's the stuff with Jack Ryan Jr. in the small Texas town is good, but I don't understand where I go from there. And so I didn't figure that out until very, very late in the book. And so I'm super proud of how the book turned out. And it's another big book. It's not a Jack Ryan Jr. It has, once again, a lot of Jack Ryan Sr. Stuff in it. And it was a ton of fun. In fact, we're trying to work an event where there's this great journalist named Alex Hollings, and he writes for Popular Mechanics and Sandbox. And he has these awesome videos called Air Power, where he explores different like hypersonic stuff, or the F-117, or he even did one on these mythical planes like the TR-3 or whatever it's called. Anyway, we're trying to get an event where it's me, Bob, and him, and he facilitates the interview so Bob can tell some incredible SR-71 stories, and we can talk about the book and do all that. So
Oh, that's cool.
it was a ton of fun, and if it's going to be my last Clancy book for a while, it's a good one to finish on, hopefully.
Yeah, that sounds awesome. So, last big question before I let you go, and it's spoiler free, obviously, but what is, what was, or what's kind of like your feeling? What does it mean to you to step into the Mitch Rapp series and Vince Flynn? Because I know Vince has meant a lot to you, has been really
Yeah,
influential, and then Kyle has been so amazing with it. What does it
yeah,
mean to you to step into that and take that over?
yeah, a lot. I mean, I I part of the reason why I think I was selected to write the Mitch Rapp books is because I didn't know Kyle, but I love the series, and so when Kyle first started writing them, there were, and the books are great, but there are moments, like I call them Mitch moments, in each one of the books where he just, like, you thought Vince would have written it, like it's a perfect Mitch Rapp scene. And so there were a couple times where I had gotten advanced reader copies or something, and Emily Bessler, the editor, her email address was on there. And so I would send her a note and say, "Hey, you probably don't know me, but I just love these books. And on page 123, I thought Kyle just knocked it out. Like, this is exactly what how Mitch would have written, or excuse me, how Vince would have written Mitch." And so I'm a huge, like, Vince Flynn is my all-time favorite author. And so to be able to take over those books is still kind of mind numbing, and very humbling, because Kyle took that series. I mean, it might have died. Like, it might have, after Vince passed on, that might have been it. And Kyle took that series, and then he didn't just tread water, he expanded it, and he took it in different directions and just did such an incredible job. And so the other part of it, in the Jack Ryan Jr. books, it was Jack Ryan Jr. is a secondary character. And so the Mark Cameron and now the Andreessen Wilson guys were writing the marquee characters and stuff that the whole franchise sat on. And so for me, there was certainly some trepidation coming to that book, but I also knew the entire weight of the series wasn't resting on my shoulders. Like, I could take Jack Ryan Jr. and do some things with him over the side. And frankly, that's why my first book, Target Acquired, was so narrowly focused just on Jack Ryan Jr.'s, because I wanted to figure him out as a writer. And so the Mitch Rapp series, you don't have that luxury. Like, it's only one writer for all the characters. And so there's a tremendous amount of pressure, I feel, as a fan. And then certainly the fans themselves, while they have been very, very welcoming, most of the messages I get on social media is some variant of, like, "Welcome to the series, but I love this character. Don't be the guy that screws it up." And I think that's a fair reaction as a fan, because they've been, they have been fans for 17 or 18 years now, both through Vince and Kyle. And you should, as a fan, have the expectation that the new guy that's coming in isn't going to screw it up. And so all of those things make it different. And I don't know that I would have been ready to try and do this had it not been for the Clancy ones, because I felt like that was a great intermediate step where, again, I wasn't trying to do what Mark Cameron was doing and carry the entire franchise. I could kind of mess around along the edges, and then hopefully now be the front guy for the band, I guess.
I remember the day it was announced, and I was texting all my buddies and stuff, and I text Todd Wilkins from Best Thriller Books, and I said, "Can you believe this? This is insane! Like, I'm so pumped." And he was like, "Yeah, but you didn't see it coming," and I was like, "No." And he said, "Remember when we were at Bouchercon and me and you were talking to Kyle Mills, and he mentioned something about wanting to go back and look at his old character Fade?" And I was like, "Yeah, I kind of vaguely remember that." He was like, "That was him telling us what was happening," and I didn't see it coming, and I thought, "Well, wow, that's Kyle." Kyle said it way like a year before it even happened, and I'm excited. I'm really happy for you. I can't wait for you to see what you do with it and take it over. And I think it's awesome. They couldn't have picked a better guy. Like out of all the people they could have picked,
I appreciate it.
I think you're gonna crush it for sure. And I know there's probably a lot of pressure, but just know that people like me who look up to you, who are avid readers, like I know you're gonna kill it for sure.
I really appreciate it, and Kyle has been incredible and has, I've had more than one phone call with him, and he has like sent me reams and reams of his notes and thoughts and materials and stuff, and and beyond that, the links he goes to, like when they announced it, there were still some people that weren't clear, and I swear that he responded to every single comment on social media and with some variation of, "I'm going on to do this other thing, but Don is going to be great. You'll love him," like over and
Oh yeah,
over and
oh
over
yeah.
and over again. And he's such a good guy. And I know that he is, and I can't speak to other genres, but I feel like this genre in general is very, very supportive. You have kind of the elder statesmen like Kyle and Mark Graney and Brad Taylor and Brad Thor and stuff that are genuinely trying to give younger writers a hand up. And Kyle, like I said, has gone out of his way to try and make the transition as smooth as possible. And I'm very, very grateful. He's a fantastic writer and a gentleman.
So before I let you go, because I know you got a busy schedule, and we want to enjoy the rest of your evening, but tell people where they can go to kind of stay up on what Don Bentley's doing, so they can get the latest news on Mitch Rapp and what's going to happen in 2024.
Yeah, so the easiest way to find everything I'm working on or not working on, as the case may be, is to go to my website, and it's just donbentley.books.com. So Bentley. And so you can sign up for my newsletter there. You can, I'll usually post on there interviews or places I'm going and things like that. And then if you're a social media person, I'm on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter, and my handle is the same for all three. It's just at Bentley Don B. So BentleyDonB.
Well, Don, thanks so much for doing this. I appreciate you carving out the time, and I know you're going to crush the Mitch Rapp series. And I'm waiting by the mailbox for weapons grade. But again, thank you so much.
Absolutely, Jeff. Thanks for having me.